I'm Tim Marlow. I'm Director of Exhibitions at White Cube, and my role is broad, it's strategic, it's outward facing, it works a lot with the artists and obviously on the programming across the galleries. And I'm also a broadcaster and a commentator. I run the two jobs hand in hand.
What are they, these two jobs?
Well, I make television programs for channels, and I broadcast and make arts programs and radio programs and write occasionally.
Okay.
One of the views about a big and successful gallery like White Cube is that everything that it does has to be commercially driven, because the more successful you are, the more you expand, you have bigger, more impressive buildings, therefore by definition you need to fund them. But actually, in a sense, the opposite almost applies. That in order to be successful and in order to maintain your level of success, you have to attract the best or most interesting artists. And in order to do that, of course, there is a huge commercial dimension to what you do, but artists want opportunity. They want interesting spaces, interesting contexts in which to show. Exhibitions really are best served when they're punctuation points or staging posts or opportunities to show the level of ambition of an artist. And the commercial activity can often take place around the exhibition, in private viewing rooms, at art fairs, and often, or sometimes, on the walls of the galleries. But if you make an exhibition that is only about selling work, in the end, people find you out. It's not that they don't make the most interesting exhibitions. And obviously, sometimes there is a balance between the two. But I think that one of the reasons why I work for White Cube, one of the reasons I've continued to do so over the last 9 years, is because it's experimental, because it's prepared to take risks, because it's prepared to fund and engage in projects that, for example, the public sector can't do. There are bureaucratic and economic restraints in the public sector that don't exist in the private sector. The model of the small gallery, always doing radical experimentation, it's a nice idea, but actually small galleries often have to struggle much harder to survive, and often do that by doing more commercially viable things. Now, I'm being reductive, I'm generalising. There's great work, experimental work, radical work being done in the public sector and in small galleries. But I think in the main, it's the larger and the best commercial galleries that in a way can facilitate the most interesting and radical projects. I think everyone and every gallery and every artist and every institution has been affected to some extent by the current economic crisis. I think that what's interesting is that the top end of the market has been much more resilient, partly to do with the fact that it's global, also to do with the fact that those collectors at the top end of the market are looking to build foundations, looking to build reputations for posterity, collections on a large scale, and their financial positions have been less affected by the downturn. But I think also the market is global as well, and we have expanded. We've opened in Hong Kong, we're about to open in Sao Paulo. So the idea that we're consolidating or retrenching is clearly not the case. And in a way, if you're able to expand in a sustained way during an economic downturn, that's the time to do it, because the artists look to you to give them opportunities that they're not being given elsewhere. So in a way, we're expanding at a time of economic downturn rather than the other way around. I think the idea of looking into the future and seeing how the art world will be in 20 years' time is a fascinating but futile exercise. I mean, if I'm honest, I've no idea. I have a sense that it will continue to expand. I think if you look at what's happened in the art world in the last 20 years, what has really stood out is the radical expansion of scale. I mean, just in London alone, the number of commercial galleries, the number of successful artists, the institutional expansion. Finally, we have a museum devoted solely to modern and contemporary art, Tate Modern. We never had that before. I would, but equally, if you look at the history of the art world within a 20-year period, reputations rise and they fall. I think there are certain artists, certain galleries, certain institutions that are established in terms of their position in the history of the art world over the last 20 years. But I think what's interesting is the kind of is the loss, is the wastage. So many will rise, many will fall, but I think that probably over the next 20 years the art world will continue to expand. And I think that the model for what the commercial art sector does in that time will become even more critical. And I think that because I think that we're now at a position where the institution is reaching kind of crisis point. Because I think that politically, the will to fund art and culture is diminishing. And I think we in the commercial sector have to lead the fight for public funding. We have to help as well. Because I think when an art world is utterly without public funding, it loses something. Equally, I think when an art world is only public funded, it loses something too. And there needs to be a kind of balance there. But I believe fundamentally in the public funding of art, and I also believe fundamentally in the idea that art is made as accessible to as many people as want to see it, and that requires the public sector too. But my final point is, I think that the artist increasingly becomes more and more in control of his or her destiny. I think 20 years ago, 30 years ago, artists kind of waited to be signed up by whichever galleries were around, and were almost grateful to be so. I think now they're calling the shots. I think artists have set up their own galleries sometimes. I think they're great at sometimes deciding what projects they want to do. Sometimes they make them happen themselves. And I think there's a greater independence among artists to play that system. And I think that's interesting too. This current exhibition, called My Labour is My Protest, is by an extraordinary artist called Theaster Gates. He's not yet 40. He lives in Chicago. Everything you see here in this exhibition has pretty well come from Chicago. One is a library, the greatest library of African American social and political history, that is non-commercial, that he has exhibited a section of, and the idea is that the visitor can come and engage with social and political history for a time. It's the library turned into an installation. But also, from the fire hoses to the plinth pieces to the fire trucks to the massive bookcase work that looks also like an abstract colour field painting. He's taken the stuff of specifically buildings and places in Chicago, and it's an act of transformation. So his work has a social and political content to it. It alludes to, for example, the civil rights movement, where hosepipes were used as a form of attacking or calming down protesters. It's a formally inventive language that Theaster Gates has, where he's playing with things intrinsically for their aesthetic value too. But ultimately, the show's about the relation. It's a kind of balancing act. Look at the red fire engine. Look up at the ceiling of the gallery, and you see a pulley system, and you realise that, at least in theory, one work is balancing another. And it's about the leveraging, the relationship between the art world and its market, the art world and the political world, the idea of labour and the value of labour. And he's a really important artist, I think. He's a performer. He has a musical band called the Black Monks of Mississippi. There's a film of them singing. There's his father carting his tar cart along the road in Chicago, and it's then exhibited in one of our galleries here. When Theaster was a young man, he worked with his father as a roofer, tarring the roofs around his neighbourhood for money. And Chicago, and as Theaster said, his father worked out that during the civil rights movements and protests, his father decided that in some ways to continue to work was a form of protest, that he wasn't going to let the system defeat him. And to a certain extent, that's reflected in this exhibition. But he's a very complex artist with a wide range of references, but his major motive is the regeneration of a particular area of Chicago where he is acquiring buildings, he's transforming them, he's turning them into works of art, he's using some of the content to make works of art, but he's leveraging from those buildings out into the art world and the art market the possibility of regeneration. So he's creating spaces in which artists may work, artists may exhibit, and there's a kind of community. It's a distant model of the Bauhaus. And in a way, I mean, that's a very exciting program, because it's not art for art's sake, it's art for a much broader social and political purpose.